And when I set up MoneyMatiX, it was literally out of my own personal need as a migrant that had moved here, coming from Uganda, and not understanding the ropes of money. As my children were getting older, I found myself, starting to give them poor attitudes to money, which I was concerned about. But nothing in the market could quite help me educate them properly or teach them how to manage money in this economy. Uganda is mostly a cash-based economy, and this is mostly credit-based with a lot of other things like credit files and that sort of thing. And not being able to understand those concepts, I couldn't pass on the right information to my children. So initially, our work was really around helping parents to educate their children about financial issues and financial matters. But then we found that actually there was a deeper problem. For many migrant communities, there's a big issue of the poverty premium that they're affected by. They themselves need education. And if you don't have education, you can't pass on any good information to your children. So we found ourselves in a situation where we're now trying to deliver financial education for families so that we can empower adults to be good role models for their children. And open banking has been amazing. It's amazing at trying to bridge gaps. There are a lot of solutions that are coming out that help people with thin files, for example. If you have a thin file initially, it was very hard for you to get credit, and now that is becoming easier. But one of the biggest ethos at MoneyMatiX is emphasizing the fact that if there's no education, there's no way to tackle social inclusion or financial inclusion. So it's important that people know what services are out there, how open banking can help them. Many people, even if open banking is available, don't understand its impact or how it can be helpful for them. So a very key driver for us is trying to educate them on how to maximize open banking to help them become financially and socially included.
Okay, thanks very much, Tynah. Varun, Paul, you led the Bank of England's Future Finance project, which highlighted the fact that the economy is becoming more digital. Can you talk a little bit about those kind of wider trends that you identified in that project and how they're aiming to tackle that digital gap? And Varun has not been able to join us back. I do apologise. We're not all these events have gone so seamlessly before, but we will press on and hope we get Varun back. Sorcha, I'll come to you. You're consulting to GovCo, the Global Open Finance Centre of Excellence, as Interim Chief Privacy and Risk Officer. What do you see as the real size of the potential of GovCo, based in Edinburgh, but with a global footprint, a global ambition, to support greater financial and in turn social inclusion? And what are the big ethical challenges you face in doing that?
Thanks, David. Huge question to kick off with. So the potential for the Global Open Finance Centre of Excellence, which is quite a mouthful, but we call it GovCo, is huge. It's come along at a time when I think if the past year has shown us anything, it's shown us that we need access to real information, real insight. And we need to arm our governments, our leaders with good information and trusted information so that they can design policies and design services around that real information rather than assumptions. So, and I think in that kind of global effort, UK is behind some countries and ahead of others. But I think if we looked at the next 10 years, where we need to be, we need to be very much based in that space. So I think GovCo is very timely and of its time, and I think we can capitalise on that in Edinburgh. So it's really bringing together that kind of those capabilities that make that happen. So we've got a team of data scientists who can really kind of move those combined data sets to information and insights that can shine a light on those big societal issues and really inform good decisions. In terms of the ethical challenges and barriers, they're also huge. And so operating in a space where there's big challenges and barriers typically leads you to the place of most value. So as a privacy professional, big data is full of pitfalls. But if you don't do anything, then you can't kind of get to that kind of key point of shifting the dial. So, really kind of looking at how do you move from personal data at source to de-identifying it to potentially anonymizing it. That is a space which is really challenging, and there's a lack of standards and something that we're working through. In terms of the ethical, so there's that kind of legal challenge, and obviously the UK GDPR is a high bar for a good reason. In terms of ethical, which kind of often sits at the nexus of legal and ethical anyway. Again, big challenges, and I suppose a key one is transparency of the processing. That goes into, all the terms of conditions and the privacy notices that we're all supposed to read diligently, but we half the time can't understand. How clear is it really that if it's our own data at source, how that data, or which then becomes information or perhaps de-identified data, how are we all clear on how that's being used, and to put ourselves at the center of those data choices? That's really thorny and sticky, and sometimes you have to take a very much a balanced and pragmatic approach across that.
Okay, we'll come back. We'll come back to data in a minute, but just about GovCo in general, Sorcha, what about that challenge it faces of not trying to do everything and then not doing very much? Because it's a hugely ambitious project. How do you decide where to focus for greatest impact and actually making a particular impact in tackling financial social exclusion?
That's a good question, and we're in an organization there where we've got a lot of talent and amazing ideas, and we've also got funding, and so that can be a bit of a temptation that you try and do everything because of that passion and that desire. But really, typically where you see startups and scale-ups succeed is they kind of tend to narrow and go after something really specific. That's not to say that you can't be very global in your impact, but again, it's that kind of inability to, by doing it all, people might get confused by what you're doing. So I think I think GovCo are going through that, but I think they very much recognise the other players in the space. So on one level, I would say that GovCo are in a very good position to be the connector and the joiner of the dots of other kind of pieces in that space. And then the other kind of way to have that focus is really let GovCo be led by the purpose. So by working with really good data projects, being really kind of clear on what is the purpose of why we're looking at this data, what purpose, what impact will it have, and kind of following that through. So that purpose-led approach to analysing data is really, really vital.
And obviously, Tynah, when you set up MoneyMatiX, that purpose was absolutely crucial for you. You set up with a particular kind of goal in mind. How well do you think you've done in actually, how have you had to kind of adjust over the last few years to deal with these big issues around data, around privacy and so on, while keeping that kind of end goal in mind that you want to give people better management of their finances and to pass on better habits to the next generation?
A key thing that I've found has been partnering with the right people that can help with bridging these gaps. So I remember when GDPR first came out, that was a really, really big thing, because most of our users and clients are, they wouldn't have any understanding of their rights and, things like that. So making sure that as an organization, I can be very good at signposting and supporting people to understanding their rights is a key thing. And then aligning myself with organizations that can help to deliver those things. So if it's in a space of data, it's like, okay, how can I partner with someone to help bridge those gaps so that I can focus on the education element of what I'm doing? And that's been very, very crucial to the work that I do. But also not being rigid, understanding the customer needs and the customer problems that are being solved, and then meeting people at that level. Because when you're working with vulnerable people especially, you have to be very conversant with the problems as they evolve. So COVID-19, for example, has brought a whole host of new issues, and it's how do you align yourself with the right partners to make sure that that the customer is being served across the board.
And what have been those biggest challenges for you over the last year due to COVID-19, Tynah? How have you, what have been the big challenges that have been thrown up for your business, and how have you risen to them?
One of the key ones is digitization of clients, of the users. So when you're trying to use technology for people who don't typically bank online, open banking in itself is not an option initially. So trying to find alternative ways of educating users to be able to help them uptake, open banking has been a big thing. And then COVID-19 has also highlighted very, very greatly the bigger gaps in the poverty premium, and how, for example, people from Black, Asian and minority communities have been more affected. They are more likely to be on furlough or lose their jobs because of the type of jobs that they're in. So they take up less fair credit. They don't have access to fairer credit, which basically just escalates all the issues. And it's like trying to recognize where, as an organization, we stand and how to just be very good at signposting them to all these other pieces. That's taken a bit of work.
Okay, I see that we've got Varun back with us now, which is great. So Varun, I'll ask you about 5 questions for the next 20 minutes. You led the Bank of England's Future of Finance project. What did that project, what were the key findings of that project, and what key trends was it trying to tap into in terms of how we can use open banking and open finance and look towards kind of positive goals in terms of financial and social exclusion?
Yeah, so the trends we observed back in 2019 were that the economy was becoming more digital. And because every digital transaction was leaving a trail of data, the use of data was growing rapidly too. We also saw a decline in the use of cash as part of that kind of trend. Now, I mean, those trends have clearly accelerated rapidly during the pandemic, as we've all been forced to do more remotely. On cash, the government has stepped in, that cash around for as long as people need it. Elsewhere, we clearly need to make sure that people have access to things like the internet, good internet connection, and training in basic computer skills, and that's another role for government to play. But more generally, it's the digital economy and technology more generally, I guess, doesn't have to exclude people, and that was one of the things in the Future of Finance report. But a few examples: facial recognition and biometrics have greatly reduced the pressure to remember passwords. And that's a really big deal, especially for people, for example, with deteriorating memories. And clearly for some people, not having to visit a branch physically has made finance much more accessible. So some of these things can be really positive for inclusion. Now, what's more is that open banking has shown just how inclusive technology can be for finance. And we've seen a wave of new apps. I can give a couple of examples, things like Tully and Calgera, and there are many others, where they're actually helping financially vulnerable customers to understand and better manage their finances.
Okay, and just specifically, Varun, about the report you published, the paper you published last year about the potential for an open data platform to improve access to finance for small businesses. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that's made sort of SME finance more transparent?
Yeah, definitely. So we've seen the positive impact of open banking so far, and we think it could be taken further. We were particularly taken by the principle and the way that open banking puts the value of data in the hands of the individual, empowering them to use it as they see fit. We proposed a system where users had access to even more of their data and explored what that could do for SME finance. It's an area where good information is hugely valuable and where there's been a structural gap in funding for decades. So we imagined if, for example, at the touch of a button, a small business owner could pull together their data from the Passport Office, from the DVLA, and their utilities provider to instantly pass through KYC checks and onboard with a potential new lender. And there are some examples of this happening today already. And then in another instant, they could call their banking data, their management accounts data, and their tax data all in a standardized format, and use that to provide a complete financial picture to a lender. So for the first time, a small business would be able to shop around for a loan rather than being constrained to their current account provider, which is what happens today. And this was something that we felt acutely in the depths of the crisis just recently. Now, additionally, fast-growing businesses with thin credit files would be able to bring richer data to bear on that, and they'd be able to use real-time transaction data from online marketplaces, for example, to supplement their credit files. SMEs already have shown that they really value open banking, and their adoption is already high. So we think this kind of open data platform could really help to make SME finance both more efficient and more transparent, but also it can make it more competitive and more inclusive. From the engagement we've had, we know that there's lots of support for this kind of idea, but to make it happen, we really need to see the public and private sectors pulling in the same direction. And that's something that the recent Khalifa review also talks about.
Okay, Sorcha, when we talk about
I think the gremlins don't
public
like
data together to deliver better outcomes.
Oh, sorry, David, we just lost you for a second. Could you start that
Sorry,
question?
how do you think, Sorcha, you can use public and private data to deliver better outcomes? What's the potential of GovCo to work in that area?
I think there is so many data sources out there, and obviously there's kind of lots of data which are kind of locked in those kind of walled gardens, and then there's kind of open data sources which people are using. The missing link is having a trusted data custodian or intermediary in the middle of that, bringing that together. So there's the kind of how do you do it in setting up the infrastructure, but crucial is who does it, and does the public trust who that person is, and can that organization be transparent and open about the standard that's used. And that's because there's no silver bullet, as I touched on. There's lots of thorny issues when it comes to combining data sets and privacy issues. There's no kind of one fix that sort of says, okay, this data is safe and here it is. It's actually very, very much a layered approach to managing that privacy risk and the security risks and ethical risks and all sorts in that kind of complex environment. So you have an organization that has the capability to do that, but you also trust that they will do that and they'll uphold to that standard, because in this space, in the data processing space and in compliance, what's frustrating, frankly, is a lot of organizations say that they're doing the right thing, but you can't always check that. You can't necessarily check, are they following the compliance and so forth. It's still very opaque. I would love things to be a lot kind of more transparent. So I think in the meantime, if we work towards those common standards, so I think there's the opportunity for GovCo to be that trusted entity in between that, and that's a kind of crucial piece of the whole kind of infrastructure. So yes, I think that then says, well, actually, how and what should we pull together for what reason? So that kind of brings me back to that earlier point is, yes, there's many data sources, and we could kind of do a piece of work to kind of start stitching them all together and try and present that back to whatever body. But again, if we start off with that why, of that clear purpose of what's the problem we're trying to solve, we specifically bring the data points together and analyze it for that purpose, and then look at the end-to-end output of that. That's where I think that we can unlock those kind of insights and pieces. And that, I think, could take us across public and private sector sources. It could cut across health and wealth, and all those kind of those different points to show us something that we hadn't seen before. And that would take us to a more kind of three-dimensional place, which is really, really vital. And this is so vital because if we look again at the last very intense and difficult year, we've been looking at things in a fairly one-dimensional way because the government hasn't had all the tools and information to kind of understand. So we've been looking at, well, lockdown versus public health and COVID, when actually we know it's just so much more complicated. There's obviously people's health on different dimensions, the mental health, how is it impacting businesses, impacting some businesses very adversely, and others are benefiting, and there isn't the clear kind of information that's pulling all that together. So I think it kind of brings it back to who's going to be trusted at the center of that, and why are they doing the research, and then what impact it has.
Okay, thanks, Sorcha. Varun, I'll just come back to you on one of the points that Sorcha made there about that end point. Is that it's actually understanding where we want to go in all this. So in the work you're involved in with the Bank of England, what what are the key endpoints, if you like? Where are we trying to get to in all the work that's going on?
So I guess a few different things going. There are lots of things going on, and the bit that I'm focused on is kind of this data sharing. We've seen a lot of leadership from the government on smart data and on things like open finance from the FCA, and as well on digital ID. And I guess what I think we're heading to is a more connected digital economy. The signs are that it will be in the spirit of open banking, and people will be given the rights to control their data, and therefore will empower individuals and small businesses. But I think at the heart of it, what we're trying to get to is a world in which we are making better use of the data out there, whether it's to analyze the economy, as Sorcha has just been talking about, or to as I say, enable people to get more value out of it. Now, I have to say, I think there is occasionally a bit of a false trade-off between data sharing and privacy. And for what it's worth, I think I've seen examples that show that sharing data via APIs can be actually privacy enhancing, and you can limit the amount of data you share. You can make sure it's minimal. You can put time limits on who has access to it. And sharing data in this way actually makes the system a bit more resilient, because it avoids the need to create multiple copies. It reduces cyber risk, and because you've got a system that's decentralized, it actually gives people more trust, and they don't need to worry so much in the same way that a central authority can be snooping or monitoring the whole thing. So I think alongside what Sorcha is talking about, which is a much more pseudonymized, anonymized way of gathering data in aggregate, we're trying to build a system that gives users trust in the system, gives them control. And I think getting that right is crucial, because otherwise there are big risks and key issues, both in the ethics and the privacy side.
Okay, thank you. Tynah, just touching on something you mentioned before, and something Varun mentioned there as well, the importance of education and the importance of communication as well about what this whole agenda is about. And how have you coped with communicating through MoneyMatiX what data sharing actually means to people who maybe they don't understand the principle of open banking, open finance, and so on? How important is that communication of the potential benefits, and how have you gone about trying to communicate and, as you said, to educate people in that? You're on mute, Tynah.
Sorry, I was saying that's a very good question, because it's very important to recognize that even while we're trying to collect all this data, there's many people that are being left out and who are not, for example, on the data radar, trying to help them understand the importance or the benefits of having their data sets taken. For example, access to fairer credit, trying to link in with people who have pricing for essential services and reducing extra costs to these people, educating them from that point of view and illustrating the benefits of this to them is very important, and it's a first step in educating them and helping them, for example, to improve their files, their credit files. Because when people have thin files, there's some people that mostly operate just in the cash-based side of the economy, is saying to them, listen, it's very helpful for you to try and get yourself with a good trail and how to use open banking safely and fairly. But trying to show them what the potential benefits are is extremely crucial, and it gets a better reception. So it's more like education and directional support for those who are declined for credit or having poorer outcomes, to help them understand the benefits.
Okay, thank you. And Sorcha, just a similar point, how important is data literacy in all this, and communicating actually how open banking and open finance can help individuals and businesses in a practical way?
It's so vital, and I think we've just got a long way to go. We still use so much jargon. I personally probably still use a lot of jargon as well, much as I try not to, but it's kind of implicit in the kind of data world that we work in, and that is excluding, how clear are we on, people what is open finance, you know, what are the kind of big terms in here. It's a big problem working in data protection and privacy, because you know, a lot of time you're spending time in as helping everyone get on the same page in terms of what do we mean by pseudonymize or anonymize and all these kind of things. So there's a lot of big words and difficult words within that. So that's in that kind of more the terminology, which I think is excluding. It's particularly excluding in digital security and cybersecurity. So that's something that we need to kind of push through. And then in terms of really, you know, Varun talked about empowering people, putting them at the center of their data choices. They're not at the center of their data choices if they don't understand how that data is being used, or they can't, you know, read a very long privacy notice. So again, I think standards can come into play here and say, you know what, we really need very, very concise privacy notices and terms and conditions. We've got these kind of very legalese, very kind of hidden and opaque privacy notices still and conditions. And actually, you know, we need to kind of shift something here, because we keep asking for kind of more concise terms and conditions, and it doesn't happen. So I think the use of a standard or some kind of like limit to how long these things are and how kind of concise and readable they are needs to come into play. So there's a kind of a two-piece, I think there's responsibility on the side of companies, and particularly, you know, fintechs, to say, well, actually you need to do better to actually make this stuff really, really clear at the front end. And then there's the educating and helping people understand it from the other side of it. So yeah, a lot more to do on both sides.
Varun, how do you think we can do better, particularly in terms of, you know, thinking about the user and that user's design?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorcha's touched on it there. And, you know, we have this world at the moment where people are given a choice, for example, with cookies and with, you know, whether it's the terms and conditions of a social media platforms, but it's not a real choice. And at the moment, as a result of that, you know, data literacy, this literacy point is really important, but it needs to change. You know, we need to make it simpler for people. People should have the ability to see in a dashboard who has access to their data, how long they're using it for, and for what purpose. And they should be able to remove that data access and take their customer elsewhere if they want. And very recently, we've seen a big step forward from Apple in that direction, giving users greater transparency and control. And I think that's got to be the way of the future. And I really hope that's just the beginning, because at the moment, it's a false choice with too much complexity. And we can design a system that is simpler and better for the user.
Okay, I'll just go to a couple of questions in the chat box. Sorcha, I don't know whether you can take this on. For open finance to succeed, will likely require API connectivity for pensions, mortgages, investments, credit accounts. What's the key to making this happen sooner rather than later? Sorcha and maybe Varun might have a go at that one.
So I think the question kind of speaks to the fact that it needs mass adoption to really work and across the different product sets. So that kind of mass adoption piece is really, again, it's that kind of two-sided approach of that bottom up and actually that kind of influence in the industry that's key to making that happen. So I think it's just maybe doing more to kind of show what benefits have we had so far and making that really clear in terms of that bottom up side of it. I still think it's relatively opaque. And then I guess there's going to be pressure on different companies to follow those same standards. So that's going to come at the kind of that critical squeeze point. So yeah, there's no easy answer, but two-sided would be key. And Varun, I don't know if you wanted to add in.
Yeah, so I'm probably a bit more optimistic. I know that the FCA are pushing this hard now, and they've just responded to their consultation last year. They've published their response recently. And so I think they'll be putting the standards in place now, and I know they're engaging with industry to get that bit done. The bit that I have a bit more confidence on is that open banking as a proposition had limited use cases at the start, but as the system expands, it becomes more and more useful for people. And so if the regulators can put in place the standards, and it seems already from what I've seen and heard that industry participants are as keen as anything to take the APIs that they've already got in open banking and apply them to other parts of the financial system. So if there is that demand from that side, I think the use cases become more and more interesting quite quickly. And I think we're getting to this tipping point. I'm sure we've said this for many years, but where open banking and open finance can become more and more useful for users. And as I say, I'm optimistic that we'll get to that point pretty soon. The first bit is the regulators need to do their bit. They're already engaging with the industry, and I think industry are keen. And then as those use cases develop, I think it will happen. I'm optimistic.
Okay, thank you. Tynah, we touched again in one of the previous answers about what sometimes people are sometimes referred to as the unbanked. How do you reach out to those people who don't necessarily want to be reached and who want to be, as one of the questions is put, off grid or very much dealing with cash and don't want to get involved in this area? Tynah first, then I'll come to the other panelists.
I think the key thing here is grassroots engagement, so meeting people where they are, first of all, and being as transparent as possible. So showing them a range of things that, could be cheaper, essential goods and service costs, the cost of energy, loans, insurance, and that. And then giving them the opportunity and allowing them to choose what and when they need the services. So a very big key thing that Varun has mentioned actually is making sure that policy is not penalizing these people, because it's okay to want to be off grid. It's just understanding what the benefits are, what is out there for you, and choosing what works for you best. So there's a very big need for grassroots engagement and very, very transparent systems that give people access to all this information, and then they can pick and choose how they engage with, how they share their data, how they use open banking from an informed point of view.
Sorcha, I know you need to leave us relatively soon, but we do have some great examples in Scotland of amicus ID and people like that trying to providing identities to people who are not in the system. I just wondered what do you think, Sorcha, about that kind of the ethical implications as well of reaching out?
Yeah, I philosophically, and obviously working in privacy, I obviously advocate people's choices and people's right to be let alone, and people's right to kind of go off grid or not sort of participate in that kind of mass piece, or not to need to use social media, whatever it is that you make as a choice as an individual and as a citizen. However, privacy is not the same thing as secrecy and hiding. So obviously there is, and data rights are very important, but they're not absolute. So actually, sometimes we'll cut across data rights if there is a need to save someone's life or to understand fraud and use cases. So there's that kind of, maybe that's that separation of secrecy and hiding, and often case doing something wrong, and the police and other kind of authorities need to act and cut across that. But if you just simply want to not use all the mass kind of digital tools, I think that's a personal choice which absolutely needs to be respected. So here's where I think it's going to get really, really interesting in the next year or so, as we kind of look at who's had the COVID vaccine, who hasn't, and how does that affect their identity and so forth. So I think we need to be really kind of careful and respectful that we respect human rights at the core of this and don't force people into those kind of situations. So there's not a kind of, again, not a one easy answer, but I think it starts with just respecting people's choices. And again, I think that's to do with the government and kind of core entities, but it's also about social pressure, social pressure that, have you had your vaccine? Do you believe this one thing? Or are you on social media? I think, again, it's sort of respecting that and allowing people to have diverse views or diverse habits within that. So it's kind of big questions for our society.
Varun, any comments from you on how we give digital identities to people who might want them, and what we do or what we don't do with people who don't want to engage and get involved? Absolutely.
So I agree with everyone else that you have to give people a choice. It's not about forcing them to do something. And people have their reasons. Two innovations that I'll talk about. One is digital ID, you mentioned, where I think actually of the 1.2 million people that are unbanked, a big barrier for some of them is the fact that they don't have a fixed address. And a fixed address is the core basis upon which we identify people in this country. A digital ID can help significantly with that, because it can take away the need to have a fixed address, and you can have other ways to identify someone. And the other barrier is often the lack of access to a passport or a driving license, where many people don't need that and therefore cannot identify themselves. but a digital identity could be done much more cheaply and in a much more accessible way. So if we can get digital ID right and make sure it's not mandatory, it's an option, then people may choose to engage with that. The other innovation that I'll talk about, and this is further out, it's not so immediate, but the Bank of England's been talking a little bit about central bank digital currency. And it can be a very good complement, because you could design a central bank digital currency in such a way that actually is more inclusive than the financial system of today, in the same way that I just described about digital currency, digital ID. But we haven't made any decisions on it yet, but our principles would definitely be to make sure that it's optional and it is something that goes alongside cash, to give people that choice. So as I say, the bank is and the Treasury have launched a task force on central bank digital currency, and there's also, if anyone's interested, an engagement forum that's been launched on CBDC.
Okay, thank you. Tynah, you talked about kind of sort of grassroots engagement there. And we've talked about the different sort of costs of living that can be a real challenge for people. There's a question in the box about housing costs are very often one of the biggest drains on household budgets. And there's a question saying, are there any initiatives that look at the relationship between the prevailing housing market and poverty levels? Now, I don't know whether you're aware of that, but how much of a challenge can housing costs be to people trying to get on top of their finances? And yeah.
It's a very big challenge, especially for, as we're talking about the different communities that are mostly financially excluded. Housing is the top issue, housing and related costs, you know, council tax payments and these things. And sometimes, again, it's down to education, again, not understanding what services are available, not understanding what the laws and their rights are. The second challenge is also paying premiums for these services, paying a premium, and where, for example, in some cases, it's cheaper for you to own your own home than be renting, but you've not been accepted to have a mortgage, and therefore you're forced to pay more money to a landlord than buy your own property. And it's really trying to sit back and you know, take that ego eye view to say, what's the best outcome for this user in particular? What is their trend? What's the trend? What is all the data saying to help this person pay the most affordable way to live their life, you know, to have their housing going on? So again, it's down to working with anchor organizations to use open banking to signpost vulnerable people to the right services. So it's a host of education combined with, you know, fairer credit initiatives. And there's a few things helping. For example, people with thin credit files now can get access to mortgages and loans and that. But it's how do you educate the people and help them to understand what their rights are and how to get the best outcomes? Because housing, sometimes you find that the poorer you are, the more you pay for your services, which is bizarre in itself. So it's working with anchor organizations that can help to bridge these gaps, and then working at the grassroots to understand the best outcomes for these people.
Okay, and still with you, Tynah, in Scotland, we are seeing a growing Fintech for Good movement. We are seeing an increasing number of young Fintech businesses trying to tackle kind of social challenges around credit unions like SOAR and benefit calculator like Invest. Mm-hmm. You know, how important is it that all those different organizations are kind of working together in a collaborative way to try and plug those gaps? Because as we've heard before, not everybody can do it on their own.
It's extremely, if we don't do that, we're not going to get anywhere, because one of the key things about vulnerable users is it's not one size fits all. So when you work together and put all these different things together, you're able to reach far. Not only are you able to reach further, but you have richer data sets. You have access to a bigger pool of vulnerable people who will then tell you what data you need to be looking at. So it's extremely important. And I have to commend Scotland for that, actually, that the connectivity is there, you know, even universities tapping in and everyone's trying to lend a hand. It's how we move on to the next step, because having the data sets is one thing, but involving the actual vulnerable users in designing solutions is very key, and that's still a big gap. we know what the data sets are saying, and then we go away and try to design solutions. But we need a platform where the vulnerable users as well are involved in designing the solutions. And if we do that, then that means that they are not excluded. That in itself is inclusion in itself. So it's a key thing to have the education piece, so that we can plug it onto all these solutions and involve the vulnerable users in creating the right solutions for them. Because otherwise the data is just one thing, it says one thing, what the user does is a different thing, and we have to be able to marry those two.
Okay, Varun, I'd be interested in your comments on that, but also the whole idea of kind of collaboration. In the Khalifa review of UK FinTech that was published a couple of months ago, there was a very clear comment that the elements of the FinTech community and, quote, their well-intentioned supporters are not pulling together into a single vision. Obviously, FinTech is right at the heart of what we're talking about today. Do you think that was fair criticism? And if the different players are not working together as an effective team, what are the problems?
So just first on the inclusion point earlier, I think from my perspective, I totally agree with what Tynah said. And I think one of the things in the background that's happening is because you've got competition from innovators, you've got this group of firms, fintechs, who are trying to address different problems to the incumbents. And for too long, there's a group of people who've been left behind and not part of the key business proposition. But it's great that you've got an incentive because of the competition that's been opened up, not just by open banking, but elsewhere. You've got innovators who are trying to help different parts of the market, of the consumer market, and that's great. And there are some examples, and the more we can do to support that, the better. And the greater diversity you can bring, the better. On the coordination point, I completely agree that we need to be pulling in the same direction. I have to say, from where I sit, I've seen a good amount of coordination across the regulators and across government on, as I said, on things like smart data and open finance. And on DCMS's digital ID. And that's another example where clearly to make something like that work, and they've recognized that you need to have interoperability across the whole system. You need public sector working with private sector, because anything like that needs to be adopted and accepted by all. So as I say, I'm pleased with where it's at the moment, but that doesn't mean we can't go further. So I think the Khalifa review was right to say that we need to do more. And I think it's right to say that you can have structures in place that force industry and public sector to work together to develop these solutions. And I think we could definitely benefit from more of a conversation between industry and regulators, particularly on SME finance, the thing that I was talking about earlier. And I'm really pleased that that was in the Khalifa review and that Ron highlighted that.
I mean, just to touch on that last point, Varun, just that issue that comes back time and time again of open banking, open finance, and technology generally running ahead of regulation. You know, how do you think broadly we are doing at the moment in terms of regulating what is a very fast growing kind of financial technology industry?
It's a good question. And I think what you've seen in the kind of landscape at the moment is that the FCA and the bank in particular are trying to be as supportive of innovation as we can be, for a number of reasons. From the FCA's perspective, I'm sure it's about consumers and giving them choice and making sure they're supported by the financial system. And from the bank's perspective, as I mentioned a few times, competition in the financial system and diversity in the financial system is really important for financial stability. So we're all trying to encourage innovation. Now, we all have to be mindful of financial stability, and we take steps a lot throughout to try and ensure that the innovation is done safely. I'll give you a couple of examples where I think we're trying certainly to get this right. We are supporting small and growing firms in the PRA about to become banks if they want to become banks. And to make sure that the requirements of them grow as they grow. That gives it a proportional and a supportive environment, but it ensures that as they grow and they become more systemically important, we have the environment and the rules in place for that. The FCA sandbox at the really small end of the spectrum enables innovators to try out new techniques and to do so safely, before they become a well-established proposition. And that has been shown internationally and claimed to be a good environment to be able to try new things and to do so safely. And another example where things are moving very quickly is in AI. And it's an area where clearly innovation is incentivized to move things on quickly, but it's an area where we need to, as regulators, be on top of it. And it's somewhere where I'm closely involved because we, the bank, with the SDA and the ICO, are working closely with industry to have a conversation about how AI is being used in the financial system, how it can and should be used to try and make sure that AI can be deployed safely in the financial system in the future. And that's an ongoing conversation as part of something we have called the AI Public-Private Forum. And I think it's a really good example from what we've seen so far of how we're learning from industry practitioners, the experts in the field, to think about the issues that are arising and how they are able to flag to us how we can be helpful. And at the end of the day, because it requires users' individual trust at the end of the day, if they want to deploy this technology, we are actually all working in the same direction. They want a system where individuals can trust it, and we want a system where individuals can trust it and where it can be deployed safely, as I say, in the financial system.
Okay, I'll just come to a final question to both the panelists. Tynah, first of all, this is a very wide and complex agenda with a lot of interlocking issues, a lot of parties involved. What's the biggest challenge from your perspective in actually, moving the whole open banking, open finance agenda forward to achieve the kind of results we want, and how can it be best addressed?
Thank you for that question. To use the example we've just talked about, with the Financial Conduct Authority's sandbox, we need such an approach when we're dealing with this. The FCA sandbox has been a very good example of how connectivity can help you to link into things, getting people to test technologies before they go live on the market. It gives them an education in terms of they know what the rules are supposed to be. You design a product that's more useful for the end user, gives you trust immediately. It's a very quick and fast way to. So if we could apply that model to a lot of all the other stuff we're doing in open banking and open finance, we'll definitely see better results. A key thing that I've found in my work with MoneyMatiX is that we need also effective relationships. So not just meetings and networking for the sake of networking, but having measurable outcomes that are standardized. When people are trying to do corporate social responsibility, how are we measuring that that's actually happening? And how are we putting those bigger organizations to task to ensure that these things are happening? Because sometimes you find that, as Sorcha said earlier, people are saying they're doing things that they're not actually doing. How do we put them to task? And how do we standardize the measurement of this? That's a very key area that will help. But certainly something like the FCA sandbox has been a great example of how connectivity can be absolutely amazing to help even the end user feed into what solutions we're delivering.
Okay, Varun, a final word from you briefly, biggest challenge in moving this agenda forward and how we rise to it.
Yeah, we've talked quite a bit about coordination. I think that's a real key part of this. I think the regulators and the authorities need to listen to what's needed out there, whether that's from end users or from the industry, the providers. And then we need some leadership. And we've seen bits of that, and we've seen some great examples of that. So what we need to have is that leadership, the coordination, the dialogue between industry, public and private sectors. And once everyone's pulling the same direction, I think we can see some real progress. And as long as we have the end user in mind throughout, that'll be the most important bit.
Okay, thanks very much, Varun, to Tynah and to Sorcha and to the DDI for organising this event. Look at the website ddi.ac.uk to get an idea of the breadth of what the DDI is doing. Apologies for the technical issues that we've had today. These things happen. If you did enjoy this event, we'll be back with a discussion on the role of data-driven innovation in AI, which we talked about at the end there on the 19th of May at 11 a.m. I've been David Lee. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I've got my first trip back to the pub booked for tonight, so I'm hoping the beer garden at Stags in Musselburgh won't be too chilly. So whatever you're planning for the rest of your day and your weekend, I hope you enjoy yourself. And when you get back to work, keep collaborating, keep innovating, and keep doing your bit to support greater financial and social inclusion. Cheers for now.